The rain had stopped falling over Honolulu, but the clouds remained low and heavy, pressing down upon the city like a premonition. It was January 17th, 1893, a Tuesday, the kind of day that begins quietly and ends with the death of nations. In Iolani Palace, the most elegant royal residence in all the Pacific, Queen Liliʻuokalani stood at her window and watched American Marines march through her capital streets. They moved in formation, rifles gleaming despite the gray tropical light, their boots marking time against the coral blocks of King Street. They had come ashore the previous afternoon from the USS Boston, which sat anchored in Honolulu harbor like a steel-hulled verdict. No shots had been fired. No declaration of war had been issued. No ultimatum had been delivered by any head of state. The Queen was 54 years old. She had ruled for less than 2 years. She was educated, multilingual, a composer of music that would outlive the century. She was also, in that moment, watching her kingdom evaporate. Across the city, in a building that belonged to a man who sold groceries, a small group of American businessmen were reading aloud a proclamation. They called themselves the Committee of Safety, though safety had nothing to do with their intentions. They declared the Hawaiian monarchy abolished. They proclaimed a provisional government. They announced that they would seek immediate annexation by the United States of America. They did not represent the Hawaiian people. They had not been elected. They held no legal authority. What they held was something far more useful in the arithmetic of empire. They held sugar plantations. They held shipping contracts. They held 30 years of accumulated grievance against a monarchy that dared to govern in the interests of its own people. And behind them, validating every word of their treasonous declaration, stood 164 United States Marines. The future of an independent Pacific nation hung in the balance. Not because of war, not because of revolution, but because a handful of wealthy men decided that a queen was bad for business. This is the story of how America stole a kingdom, not through conquest, not through treaty, but through the cold machinery of commerce dressed in the costume of civilization. It is a story of sugar and sovereignty, of missionaries and manipulation, of a crime so brazen that an American president would call it exactly that, and so profitable that his own country would commit it anyway. It is a story that has never stopped being true. To understand what died that January morning, you must first understand what lived. And what lived was something that the men of the Committee of Safety could never admit. The Kingdom of Hawaii was not a primitive backwater awaiting salvation. It was a modern constitutional monarchy, recognized by every major power on earth. The myth, the one told in American newspapers, in congressional debates, in the private clubs where businessmen smoked cigars and discussed the destiny of races, was simple. It went something like this. The Hawaiian Islands were a paradise of confused savages, lifted slowly toward civilization by the patient work of American missionaries. These missionaries had brought Christianity, literacy, and progress to a benighted people. Their sons and grandsons had built businesses, established rule of law, created prosperity out of primitive chaos. But now, tragically, the native Hawaiian population was proving incapable of self-governance. They were electing corrupt officials. They were threatening property rights. Their queen was consolidating power, moving backward toward absolutism. Annexation by America would be a mercy. It would complete the civilizing project. It would secure the islands from the predatory ambitions of Britain, France, or Japan. This myth was believed. It was believed in Washington. It was believed in Boston. It was believed in the editorial offices of newspapers that had never sent a correspondent west of California. It was repeated so often that it became common knowledge, and common knowledge is the most dangerous kind of lie. The truth was exactly the opposite. By 1893, Hawaii possessed a written constitution, a bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary, and a civil service that functioned with professional competence. Honolulu had electric lights, telephone lines, and a modern hospital. Hawaiian literacy rates exceeded those of the United States. The kingdom maintained diplomatic relations with dozens of nations. It had signed treaties with America, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia. Its monarchs had traveled the world, meeting with presidents and emperors, conducting statecraft on the global stage. King Kalakaua, Liliʻuokalani's brother and predecessor, had been received at the White House. He had dined with Queen Victoria. He had circumnavigated the globe, becoming the first reigning monarch of any nation to do so. He spoke English and Hawaiian fluently, understood French and German, and had personally negotiated trade agreements that made Hawaii the commercial hub of the Central Pacific. This was not a land awaiting civilization. This was a civilization that had adapted, modernized, and maintained its sovereignty through 6 decades of pressure from colonial powers who wanted nothing more than to swallow it whole. And that success, that stubborn insistence on existing as an independent nation, was precisely the problem. The hidden reality of Hawaii's overthrow was never really hidden. It was simply too ugly for polite company. The men who destroyed the monarchy knew exactly what they were doing and exactly why. They wrote it down. They published pamphlets. They sent letters to Washington. They left a paper trail so complete that it reads less like conspiracy and more like confession. The heart of everything was sugar. Hawaii's volcanic soil and tropical climate produced sugarcane of extraordinary quality. By the 1880s, sugar had transformed the islands from a subsistence economy into an export powerhouse. Massive plantations covered the landscape. Immigrant laborers from China, Japan, Portugal, and the Philippines worked the fields. Processing mills operated around the clock. Ships departed Honolulu laden with raw sugar destined for refineries on the American mainland. The sugar planters, most of them American citizens or descendants of Americans, had grown extraordinarily wealthy. They owned the best land. They controlled the labor supply. They dominated commerce. But they faced a problem. Sugar is heavy. Sugar is perishable. Sugar is expensive to ship. And the American government charged tariffs on imported sugar. Those tariffs cut directly into profits. Every cent paid at the customs house was a cent that did not flow into the pockets of the plantation owners. In 1875, King Kalakaua had negotiated a reciprocity treaty with the United States. Under this agreement, Hawaiian sugar could enter America duty-free, and American-manufactured goods could enter Hawaii duty-free in return. For the planters, this was an economic miracle. Hawaiian sugar suddenly held a massive competitive advantage over sugar from Cuba, Brazil, or anywhere else. Fortunes multiplied. Production soared. The planter class transformed from prosperous to powerful. But the treaty came with conditions. In exchange for duty-free access, Hawaii was required to grant the United States exclusive use of Pearl Harbor as a naval coaling station. The Queen's government did not want to give up Pearl Harbor. The Hawaiian people did not want foreign warships in their waters. But the sugar planters wanted their tariff exemption. The treaty was signed. The harbor was ceded. It was the first piece of Hawaiian sovereignty traded for American dollars. The planters thought they had won. They were wrong. The treaty had an expiration date. And more importantly, it created a dependency that made Hawaii vulnerable to a single stroke of American legislative power. That stroke came in 1890. The McKinley Tariff, named for Congressman William McKinley of Ohio, transformed American trade policy. Among its many provisions was one that seemed minor at the time but proved catastrophic for Hawaii. The tariff eliminated duties on all foreign sugar entering the United States. At the same time, it provided a bounty, a direct payment of 2 cents per pound, to American domestic sugar producers. Overnight, Hawaii's competitive advantage vanished. Cuban sugar could now enter America at the same price as Hawaiian sugar. Louisiana sugar producers received government subsidies that Hawaiian producers did not. The reciprocity treaty that had built the sugar fortunes was suddenly worthless. Profits plummeted. Land values collapsed. Banks called in loans. The plantation economy, which had seemed so invincible, now teetered on the edge of ruin. The planters faced a simple choice. They could accept their diminished position and learn to compete in a fair market. Or they could remove the barrier that prevented them from receiving those domestic subsidies. That barrier was Hawaiian independence. If Hawaii became American territory, Hawaiian sugar would become American sugar. The bounty would apply. The profits would return. All that was required was the elimination of a sovereign nation. The man who understood this calculation most clearly was Lauren Andrews Thurston. He was 40 years old, a lawyer by training, the grandson of one of the first American missionaries to arrive in Hawaii. His family had spent 3 generations transforming themselves from servants of God into servants of commerce. By 1893, Thurston was the undisputed political operative of the planter class. He edited the newspaper they owned. He drafted the legislation they wanted. He lobbied in Washington when their interests required American cooperation. Thurston did not hate the Hawaiian monarchy. Hatred implies passion. Thurston was not a passionate man. He was a transactional one. He looked at Queen Liliʻuokalani the way a bank examiner looks at a failing enterprise. He saw liabilities exceeding assets. He saw a reorganization opportunity. In May of 1892, Thurston traveled to Washington. He sought meetings with anyone who might support the removal of the Queen. He found an ally in Secretary of the Navy Benjamin Tracy, who told him that if the Hawaiian government were overthrown, the United States would not interfere. He found sympathy with Secretary of State James Blaine, who spoke of American destiny in the Pacific. He returned to Honolulu with quiet assurances that the United States would not protect the Hawaiian monarchy against its own subjects. This was the green light, not a written promise. Nothing so crude as a formal authorization, but a wink, a nod, an understanding between gentlemen that when the moment came, Washington would look the other way. The conspirators organized themselves carefully. They called themselves the Annexation Club, then the Committee of Safety. They were 13 men in total, 6 Americans, 5 Hawaiians of American descent, 1 Englishman and 1 German. Not one of them held any position of authority in the Hawaiian government. Not one had been elected to anything. They were private citizens plotting the overthrow of their own country's legal government. They waited for a pretext. Queen Liliʻuokalani provided one. Since the Bayonet Constitution of 1887, forced upon her brother King Kalakaua at gunpoint by an earlier generation of the same business interests, the Hawaiian monarchy had been stripped of most real power. Property qualifications limited voting. Cabinet ministers could not be dismissed by the sovereign. The legislature was dominated by representatives of the planter class. The Queen wanted to restore the monarchy's constitutional authority. She wanted to enfranchise her people. She wanted to undo the document that had been imposed by coercion. In January of 1893, she announced her intention to promulgate a new constitution. This was the opening Thurston had been waiting for. Within hours, the Committee of Safety declared that the Queen was attempting a revolutionary act. They claimed she had violated her oath. They insisted that only annexation by the United States could prevent chaos. They dispatched a message to John L. Stevens, the American minister to Hawaii, requesting military support. Stevens was already on their side. He had written to Washington months earlier, advocating annexation. He believed that Hawaii should belong to America as a matter of racial and strategic necessity. He ordered 164 Marines ashore from the USS Boston. They took up positions across the street from the government building, their guns pointed at the heart of Hawaiian sovereignty. The Committee of Safety did not have the support of the Hawaiian people. They did not have legal authority. They did not even have enough weapons to fight if challenged. What they had was the United States Navy standing behind them, an implicit threat that any resistance would be met with American firepower. Queen Liliʻuokalani understood the mathematics. She could order her troops to fight. They would die. Civilians would die. And in the end, the result would be the same. America would take what it wanted. She chose to yield. Her formal protest, delivered that afternoon, stated the case with devastating clarity. She surrendered her authority, she wrote, not to the provisional government but to the superior military force of the United States. She did so under duress. She expected that when the facts were known, the United States would undo the action of its representative and restore her constitutional government. She would wait 100 years for an American apology. She would wait longer than that for justice. What was lost in those January days cannot be measured in acres or dollars, though acres and dollars tell part of the story. The symbolic sacrifices began immediately and continued for decades. The first was Pearl Harbor. Under the Reciprocity Treaty, the United States had usage rights to the harbor. Under annexation, it would own the harbor outright. The strategic value was incalculable. Pearl Harbor was the finest natural deepwater port in the Central Pacific. It could shelter an entire battle fleet. It could project American naval power across thousands of miles of ocean. It would become, within 50 years, the anchor of American military supremacy in Asia and the Pacific. The Hawaiian kingdom had resisted for decades. Queen Liliʻuokalani's brother had only ceded usage rights under extreme pressure. The full transfer of sovereignty represented not just a loss of land but a loss of neutrality. Hawaii had survived as an independent nation precisely because it remained outside the orbit of any single colonial power. Britain, France, America, and Germany had all coveted the islands. None had been willing to go to war to take them. The kingdom had balanced between these rivals, playing them against each other, maintaining independence through diplomatic skill. Annexation ended that balance forever. Hawaii became an American possession. Its neutrality became American strategic interest. Its harbor became an American military base. The dreams of continued independence, of perhaps joining a future Pacific Federation of sovereign nations, were drowned in the waters where battleships would one day burn. The second sacrifice was the Crown lands. The Hawaiian monarchy controlled approximately 1 million acres of territory designated as Crown lands. These were not the personal property of the sovereign but lands held in trust for the benefit of the Hawaiian people. The revenues supported the government. The resources provided for citizens. The lands represented the material foundation of national existence. The provisional government seized these lands immediately. When annexation was formalized in 1898, they were transferred to the United States. The American government did not compensate the Hawaiian people for this transfer. It did not acknowledge any debt or obligation. It simply took the land, as creditors take collateral, as victors take spoils. Those lands would later include some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. Hotels would be built on them. Military installations would rise from them. Corporations would lease them for pennies and sell products worth millions. The Hawaiian people would watch as their ancestral property generated wealth that flowed everywhere except to them. The third sacrifice was sovereignty itself. A constitutional monarchy was replaced by an oligarchy. The provisional government was not provisional. It became the Republic of Hawaii, with Sanford Dole, cousin of the pineapple magnate, as its president. Dole had no democratic mandate. He was installed by the same committee that had overthrown the Queen. The new republic restricted voting to those who would swear allegiance to it and meet property qualifications designed to exclude native Hawaiians from political participation. For 5 years, from 1893 to 1898, this illegitimate government pretended to be a nation. It sought annexation repeatedly. It was refused repeatedly. President Grover Cleveland, after receiving a detailed investigation by his Special Commissioner James Blunt, concluded that the overthrow had been an act of war by the United States against a friendly nation. He called for the restoration of the Queen, but restoration required the consent of Congress. And Congress, controlled by interests sympathetic to the planters, refused. The Queen waited. Her people waited. Justice did not come. Then came the Spanish-American War. American warships needed coaling stations in the Pacific. The Philippines were about to become American territory. The strategic case for Hawaii suddenly overwhelmed all other considerations. In July of 1898, the Newlands Resolution annexed Hawaii to the United States. Note the mechanism. Not a treaty. A resolution. Treaties require a 2/3 vote of the Senate. Resolutions require only a simple majority. The annexationists knew they could not obtain 2/3. Too many senators had moral qualms. Too many understood the illegitimacy of what was being done. So they changed the rules. They used a procedure normally reserved for domestic legislation to acquire a sovereign nation. 29,000 Hawaiian citizens had signed petitions against annexation. They represented the majority of the native population. They traveled to Washington. They lobbied. They pleaded. They were ignored. The flag of the Hawaiian kingdom came down. The stars and stripes went up. A nation that had existed for over a century ceased to exist in the span of a morning. The aftermath was not freedom. The aftermath was not prosperity. The aftermath was dispossession dressed as democracy. Hawaii became a territory, not a state. Its residents were American nationals but not American citizens. They could not vote in presidential elections. They had no representation in Congress. Their governor was appointed by the president. The planters who had orchestrated the overthrow now controlled the new territorial government. They wrote the laws. They set the wages. They determined who could own land and who could work it. The sugar plantations expanded. The pineapple industry emerged. Dole and his associates transformed Hawaii into an agricultural factory, importing ever more laborers from Asia to work fields that had once belonged to Hawaiian families. The native population, devastated by a century of introduced diseases, shrank further into marginality. By the early 20th century, ethnic Hawaiians were a minority in their own homeland. The crown lands became territorial lands. They were leased at favorable rates to corporations with connections to the territorial government. Homesteading programs promised land to small farmers but delivered mostly to those with capital and contacts. The subsistence economy that had sustained Hawaiians for 1,000 years was dismantled in favor of an export economy that enriched shareholders in Boston and San Francisco. Meanwhile, the Queen lived out her days in quiet dignity. She was arrested after a failed counter-revolution in 1895, confined to a single room in her own palace for months, and forced to sign a formal abdication under threat of the execution of her supporters. She wrote music. She wrote her memoirs, a book called Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen, which detailed the theft of her nation with devastating precision. She traveled to Washington repeatedly, petitioning for justice. She never received it. She died in 1917, 24 years after the overthrow, her kingdom still captive. Her people inherited not a nation but a nostalgia. They retained their language, though the territorial government attempted to suppress it. They preserved their traditions, though they were treated as quaint entertainment for tourists rather than the living culture of a sovereign people. They remembered what had been taken. They passed that memory from generation to generation. Statehood came in 1959. Hawaii became the 50th star on the flag, admitted to the Union in a process that many historians would later describe as fatally flawed. The plebiscite offered only two options: statehood or continued territorial status. Independence was not on the ballot. International observers were not invited. The vote took place under the authority of the same annexation that had violated international law in the first place. The hotels rose. The military bases expanded. Pearl Harbor became the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet, the command center for wars in Korea and Vietnam, the hub of American power projection across half the globe. Tourists arrived by the millions, seeking paradise, spending money that flowed through an economy still dominated by the descendants of the men who had overthrown the Queen. And the Hawaiian people remained, in their own homeland, marginalized and celebrated in the same moment. Their faces adorned postcards. Their dances entertained hotel guests. Their language appeared on street signs. But the land belonged to corporations and the government. The power belonged to those who could afford to exercise it. The sovereignty that their ancestors had fought to maintain was a memory taught in schools as history, not as politics. 100 years after the overthrow, in November of 1993, the United States Congress passed a resolution. It was called the Apology Resolution. President Clinton signed it into law. The resolution acknowledged that the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii had occurred with the active participation of agents of the United States. It acknowledged that the native Hawaiian people never directly relinquished their sovereignty. It acknowledged that the suppression of Hawaiian language and culture had been deliberate and harmful. It apologized. The language was careful. It was legalistic. It was designed to express regret without creating liability. The resolution explicitly stated that it was not intended to serve as a basis for legal claims against the United States. It admitted wrongdoing but offered no remedy, said sorry but changed nothing. This is the mathematics of empire. The crime is committed. The profits are extracted. The generations pass. And when enough time has elapsed, when the perpetrators are dead and their grandchildren are respectable, an apology is issued. The apology costs nothing. The stolen lands remain stolen. The lost sovereignty remains lost. The descendants of the victims are asked to appreciate the gesture. The descendants of the perpetrators continue to own the hotels. The question of what was won and what was lost has no simple answer, because the answer depends on who is counting and what is being counted. If you count in naval bases and strategic position, America won the Pacific. Pearl Harbor projected power across 10,000 miles of ocean. It made possible the defeat of Japan in the Second World War. It underwrote American hegemony for a century. Every aircraft carrier that transits the Pacific, every nuclear submarine that patrols beneath its waves, every satellite that orbits above it, is enabled by the possession of Hawaii. By that calculation, the overthrow was the beginning of American supremacy in the largest ocean on Earth. If you count in dollars, the verdict is more ambiguous. The sugar planters who overthrew the Queen saw their short-term profits restored, but the sugar industry ultimately declined. The plantations closed one by one throughout the 20th century, replaced by tourism and military spending as the pillars of the Hawaiian economy. The descendants of the sugar barons diversified. They became bankers and real estate developers and investment fund managers. They remained wealthy, but the specific industry that had motivated the overthrow became an afterthought. If you count in human costs, the ledger is devastating. A sovereign people were subjugated. A culture was suppressed for generations. A language nearly died. A population was displaced from its ancestral lands and reduced to minority status in its own home. The psychological wounds of colonization, the generational trauma of dispossession, the ongoing struggle for recognition and rights, these cannot be quantified, but they are real. They manifest in health statistics, in incarceration rates, in homelessness, in the continuing fight for dignity in a society that celebrates Hawaiian culture while marginalizing Hawaiian people. And what of the question of legality? What of the claim that what was done was not merely wrong but criminal? The evidence is unambiguous. The Blunt Report, commissioned by President Cleveland in 1893, concluded that the overthrow was an act of war conducted without the authorization of Congress or the President. The subsequent Morgan Report, commissioned by a Senate hostile to Cleveland, disagreed but relied on testimony from the very conspirators who had benefited from the coup. Modern legal scholars, examining the record with the benefit of hindsight and the development of international law, have consistently found that the annexation violated the norms of sovereignty and self-determination that the United States itself claims to uphold. But law is not justice. Law is the codification of power at a particular moment in time. The men who stole Hawaii had the power. They wrote the laws. They controlled the courts. They determined what would be remembered and how. The consequences ripple outward still. The Hawaiian sovereignty movement continues to advocate for restoration of some form of self-governance. Some seek full independence. Others seek federal recognition as a Native Hawaiian governing entity, similar to the status of Native American tribes on the mainland. The debates are complex, the politics fraught, the prospects uncertain. But the underlying question remains as sharp as it was in 1893. Does a people have the right to govern themselves? And if that right was taken by force and fraud, does it ever truly expire? Perhaps the most haunting truth is this. The overthrow of Hawaii was not an aberration. It was a template. The same year that American Marines took Honolulu, American corporations were maneuvering in Cuba. 5 years later, the Spanish-American War would deliver Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines into American control. The same patterns repeated: economic interests seeking political control, military force deployed under cover of protecting American citizens, local governments declared illegitimate, sovereignty transferred to the United States in the name of progress and civilization. Hawaii was the proof of concept. It demonstrated that a modern nation could be taken without a formal war. It demonstrated that commercial interests could overthrow a government if they had the backing of naval power. It demonstrated that the American public could be convinced to accept imperial acquisition if it was framed as rescue rather than conquest. The lesson was not lost on those who would shape American foreign policy for the next century. From the United Fruit Company in Central America to the oil interests in the Middle East, from the Cold War interventions in Southeast Asia to the modern entanglements of military and corporate power, the model pioneered in Hawaii has been refined and repeated. Sovereignty is treated as an obstacle. Governments are removed when they become inconvenient. The language changes, but the arithmetic remains the same. Stand today on the grounds of Iolani Palace, the only royal palace on American soil, and you can feel the weight of what was lost. The building has been restored to something like its original grandeur. Tourists take photographs. Guides explain the history. Hawaiian sovereignty advocates gather on the lawn, holding signs, singing songs, keeping alive a flame that the American government has spent 130 years trying to extinguish. Across the street, where the Committee of Safety read their proclamation, modern Honolulu buzzes with traffic. High-rise hotels line Waikiki Beach. Military aircraft from Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam cross the sky. The machinery of tourism and strategic power grinds on, oblivious to the moral foundations on which it rests. But the foundations are cracked. The apology has been issued. The facts are in the record. The descendants of the Hawaiian people know what was taken and who took it. They teach their children. They organize. They persist. Empire always believes it has won. It measures victory in territory, in resources, in the submission of those it has conquered. It writes the history books. It builds the monuments. It congratulates itself on the necessity and benevolence of its dominion. But memory is not so easily controlled. The songs the Queen wrote are still sung. The language the territorial government tried to eradicate is being taught to new generations. The claim of sovereignty, never formally surrendered, never legitimately transferred, hangs in the air like the humidity before a storm. What happened in Hawaii on January 17, 1893, was not a revolution. It was not a popular uprising. It was not the natural progression of civilization over savagery. It was a corporate coup, executed by businessmen, backed by Marines, justified by racism, and normalized by time. The perpetrators were not punished. They were rewarded. They governed the territory they had stolen. They passed their wealth to their descendants. They were honored in the history books they helped to write. The victims were not compensated. They were not restored. They were offered, after 100 years, an apology that explicitly disclaimed any legal consequence. This is how empires are built, not through the honest exercise of superior force, but through the careful application of force disguised as legitimacy. Not through conquest admitted and defended, but through conquest denied and forgotten. But some things cannot be forgotten. Some crimes persist in the consciousness of those who suffered them, passed from parent to child, embedded in language and song and story. The Hawaiian people remember. They have never stopped remembering. And in that memory lies something that empire can never extinguish. The knowledge that what was taken wrongly, and the hope, persistent against all evidence, that justice, though delayed beyond all endurance, might yet, one day, come. The rain falls again over Honolulu. The clouds press low. The palace stands where it has always stood, and the Queen, in memory, still waits.